my name is Barbara Nissman, and I am joining you today from my music studio in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. And since I can't be on this stage and share with you, I thought it would be fun to invite you into my studio and share with you what I do here. And of course, I live with many of my composer friends, but I have to admit that one of my favorites, actually the favorite, is the man who's behind me. Can you see him? I have a statue of him, Franz Liszt, and he's the guy I wish I could have met had I lived 200 years ago, of course. I would have loved to have heard him play the piano because by far he was the greatest pianist who ever lived. I would have loved to have been one of his students when he taught master classes in Weimar, and I have to confess, I also would have loved to be one of these beautiful ladies that flocked around Franz Liszt because he was quite the figure. He cut quite a dashing figure. He probably was one of the most, probably the most charismatic personalities to come out of the age of Romanticism, the 19th century. And books have been written about him and his escapades and his life as a touring virtuoso. He played for thousands of people. And when Liszt would walk on the stage, he had the effect, of course he cut quite a dashing figure, and women would immediately faint and swoon and tear at his clothes. They say that a cigar butt of Liszt went for a small fortune in those days, and women would fight over the opportunity to take it home. Some would put it in their cleavage. Can you imagine that? And others would put it under their pillow to have sweet dreams of the great Franz Liszt. And of course, he was quite theatrical. You know, he'd wear these satin gloves and slowly take them off and fling them to the audience. So you understand why I've nicknamed Liszt the Elvis Presley at the keyboard. But seriously speaking, this man did more for piano playing than anyone else. He laid the foundation of bravura, virtuosic pianism, the romantic, grand bravura tradition. And of course, because of Liszt, he influenced so many composers who wrote for the piano after him. Ravel, Prokofiev, Rachmaninoff, my friend Gina Stara, Scriabin, to name a few. He really made a difference the way he treated the piano. What he did was he used the entire keyboard. He made the piano sound like an orchestra. And he could whisper, he could thunder. And there are wonderful stories about his strength at the keyboard because Liszt would come with his hands down and of course strings would start popping out of the keyboard. The pedal legs would fall off and actually the legs of the piano would start to teeter. And they actually said that at several of his concerts they would have to have a few pianos in waiting because Liszt would demolish a piano. So the pedals would be off, the legs would be flat, the piano would be flat on its side, and they would have to wheel on another piano for the next number. So he had this wonderful reputation, but he was a marvelous artist. I mean, he was a composer, he was a transcriber, he was a teacher, he was a conductor. This was a man who was a true Renaissance man, and everything he did with his flair and this genius. And I thought it would be fun to take one of his compositions and show you exactly what I mean about the way he treated the piano. And I thought the Mephisto Waltz, it's an old favorite of mine, so I just pulled it out to look at it again to share with you. And this is a good example of his pianism because Liszt originally wrote this piece for orchestra and then transcribed it for the piano. So in other words, he's making the piano do everything the orchestra can do. And I've heard both versions, and frankly, I prefer the piano version. But then I'm a pianist, so I'm probably prejudiced. But this was his instrument. He knew how to write for it. He never abused it. Actually, he loved the piano. And of course, he was a prodigy, and even at a young age, he showed this enormous talent for the instrument. So let's look at the Mephisto Waltz. And typically of the age of Romanticism, this was the time when music was being combined with literature, when it was really influenced by literature. So the Mephisto Waltz is a good example of a tone poem, where Liszt is actually telling a story. It's called program music. Now, most music is doesn't have a story. We supply the story to it. We give our own storyline to the music we hear, most of it. But with this composition, there is a definite story. So the Mephisto Waltz is based on the Faust Mephisto story, but he did not use the story by Goethe as his influence. He used a poem by the Austrian poet Lenau. And the story goes, it's subtitled The Dance at the Village Inn. So it's a real celebration. So you have Mephisto and Faust, who sold his soul to the devil, of course, and they're walking along and they come across this party. And of course they're going to go in and crash the party. So as the music begins, Liszt makes us hear all the musicians tuning up their instruments. So it starts like something like this. Makes it very virtuosic. And the wonderful thing about Liszt's writing, I know it sounds difficult, he uses a lot of octaves, you'll see a lot of scales and cadences, but he knew the instruments so well, and he knew what fit under the hand. So in other words, he never asked the pianist to stretch or abuse their muscles. And once you understand what he's doing, then you can master it, and it really sounds more difficult than it actually is because it fits so well under the hands. So when I say that his music is pianistic, that's exactly what I mean. He writes for the instrument. Other composers did not write for the instrument as well. You think of Beethoven or you think of Schubert, but Liszt, he knew how to write because he was such a wonderful pianist. So anyway, we're back at the Village Inn. So we finally come to the waltz. Figurations. He makes the pianist do all these scales up and down the keyboard. Okay, so that's really the first section, and then it's obvious that Liszt and Mephisto are now part of this party, part of this driving waltz. It's not a Viennese waltz. It's definitely a passionate romantic expression. A devilish waltz, that's what we call it. So in the middle section, and there are three parts to this composition. It's a very extended tone poem. In the middle section, here's the storyline. Faust spies this very attractive young lady. I've read some versions where it's the bride and he seduces the bride, or other versions say it's the barmaid, but there's a seduction scene that's going to take place. And you'll hear how he progresses. And he even does one wonderful variation where I have to repeat all these notes. And then, intermittently, you're going to hear this. And that's Mephisto just grabbing somebody's violin and kind of doing his thing on it. And that'll keep interrupting what's going on. And then eventually they keep getting more and more enamored with each other. You'll hear that in this wonderful romantic music. And then we get back to the waltz. But this time it's much more driving and much more passionate. Because it really shows you how Liszt can use the piano orchestrally, and he knows how to make use of it all. He goes on, and there's a lot more showing off and a lot more cadenzas. And there's one difficult passage, I know. Let's see. That's tough for a pianist. That's the passage I really have to practice. But can you imagine what this must have sounded like when Liszt played it? I mean, I wish we had some example of his playing, but it must have been phenomenal because he would mesmerize audiences with his piano playing, and of course it was so easy for him. It didn't require hardly any effort, and so anyway, so after this waltz, then finally the lovers are together, and they're actually. At the end of the story is they waltz off into the moonlight, and you can hear the birds singing. So he writes at the end, that's the nightingale, and he does it again. And then, of course, because he doesn't want to end with just the lovers going off and disappearing, he wants a bombastic ending, so he goes... And then there's the end. So, of course, he has to end with a big flourish. So that's a rough idea of the storyline, but you'll hear Mephisto interjecting with those violin riffs, and you'll hear a very romantic Faust. He's wonderful at seduction, as was Liszt, or as were the women who I think seduced Liszt. But it's a wonderful example of romantic pianism, and it's a performance favorite of a lot of pianists, including me. It's a lot of fun to play. It's not easy, and it's the kind of music, people say, do you like to practice? Of course, I love to be at the piano, and because I'm never there, I'm always chipping away to try and get closer, and with Liszt music, you're never there. So the idea of practicing it is fun because he makes it fun because it's so well written. So let me give you a general idea of the Methister Waltz and keep the storyline in mind. I don't think you'll have any trouble following it, and then you'll be able to see what I'm talking about, how he uses this instrument. And you'll notice we're using the entire keyboard. He really established virtuosity, the bravura, the grand romantic bravura tradition we owe to Franz Liszt. So here's the Liszt Mephisto Waltz. and for the piano, not for the orchestra. And I think you might agree with me that the piano version is better than the orchestral version. and that's Liszt's Mephisto Waltz. And you know what? This is such passionate, romantic music. It's not the kind of music you can be cautious about. So when I'm performing this, oh boy, do I take a lot of risks. And sometimes they work, of course, and sometimes they don't. But you cannot play cautiously this music. And that's why, really, that's why I spend a lot of time in my studio practicing. But of course, it goes without saying, every performance is different. The piano is different. The hall is different. The audience is different. The acoustics are different. And you wake up sometimes and you're playing maybe a morning concert. You're different than you're playing an evening concert. So we're different all the time. So you had a very spontaneous performance there. And did you notice I did a lot of dropping of the hands? Actually, that's probably what Liszt did because he had such a big sound at the keyboard. And as you can see, I'm not a 300-pound football player. So when I drop my hands at the keyboard, the gravity really helps my sound. And I have no time to be there cautiously and say, oh, am I playing this note right? So you had a very inspired performance there. But before we leave, I would like to play for you another side of Liszt, a composition that shows another side of Liszt. So often Liszt is given the back of the hand and people say, oh, he's just an acrobat, a composer, a charlatan, circus music, that's all. He's just showing off at the piano. And that's not true at all. If you've listened to his sonata in B minor, you'll know that that's one of the greatest pieces in the piano literature. But I thought it would be appropriate to share with you his Consolation in D flat. And this is the composition he wrote upon hearing of the death of his good friend Chopin, and immediately sat down at the piano and was inspired to write it. In fact, I think he was inspired even by Chopin's D flat nocturne in this composition. But it's a very poignant expression of the soul. And I also want to say about Liszt, so many people forget that this was one of the most generous, charitable men. He gave away half his earnings to the poor, the indentured, anybody in need. He did so many wonderful works. But you can really see his soul coming through in this beautiful Consolation. And I, frankly, at this time in our world, I think we need to hear this kind of music. So here is Liszt's Consolation in D flat. So now you've seen two different sides of Liszt. Actually, you've seen many sides of Liszt because he was a man of many facets and personalities, and he's so much fun to share with you. We'll be visiting him again soon. So in the meantime, stay well and stay safe, and we'll see you again.